Hello, my name is Scott Camp. Robert Camp is my brother. Most of you watching this video know him as Coach Bob. You may have seen an earlier video that began with my stories of Robert and myself growing up as little boys in Charleston in California and then back in Charleston. Today I'm going to begin with a little background of how we began to play basketball as young boys with our dad. I'm not going to tell those early family stories here, and we'll begin with these family stories playing basketball, and then it will go right into the stories of Robert's career beginning in high school. Our dad was an outstanding athlete. He was 6'4". He and his mom, Mary Hattersley Camp, our grandmother, won all kinds of city and county tournaments, and I think maybe even a couple of state tournaments, both individually in the women's side for my grandmother, we called her Granny, and for Dad in the men's side. But they played some county tournaments as mixed doubles and won championships there too. In fact, the day I was born, August 31st, 1940, he was scheduled to play in the city finals in the men's championship. My mom went into labor getting ready to deliver me. He dropped out of the final championship game, rushed to the hospital to be with mom. So he forfeited that final game on that Saturday, August 31st. I was born that Saturday, and it was front page news in the sports section. That's the first time I was ever on the front page. I wasn't on the front page again till about 14 years later when I was winning city and county championships and running the mile. That was my last claim to fame ever. He also played high school basketball at Charleston High on an almost state championship team in the mid-1930s. He went on to play varsity tennis at West Virginia University in Morgantown. He played all 4 years on the varsity. Starting his freshman year, was captain of the team all 4 years, which is quite an honor for a freshman. Dad was no slouch. Dad was pretty darn good. In 1951, when I was 11, Robert was 9, we had just come back from the West Coast and had a home on number 5 Forest Drive, and we had a basketball hoop on the garage out back, and Robert and I would play back there every time we had a chance. And Dad would play against us. It would be Robert and me against Dad. We'd play 2-on-1 against him, and Dad would always win. As time went on, I got bigger and better, but before Robert and I could ever beat him, Dad would change the rules. And first rule he changed was it would be Robert and him against me. So it would be me playing the two of them. And about the time I was good enough to beat them, he changed the rules again. And then it was Robert against him and me. And the two of us could beat Robert for a long time. But Robert got bigger and Robert got better. And before Robert could beat us, he changed the rules again, and he retired undefeated. He never lost a game against us, and he bragged about that Dad was the undefeated champion of the Camp family in basketball games against us. So that's the end of the basketball that we played against Dad. Robert and I continued to play against each other and beat each other up, literally and figuratively. But our organized basketball began in the story that you'll begin to hear now. One day, Dad came home just rushing right about 5 o'clock, yelling as he came in the back door, "Elizabeth, fix some sandwiches. Boys, get your tennis shoes and a pair of shorts and a shirt, and get that laundry bag. Put the basketballs in it. We're going to go to practice." We didn't know anything about practice, but our church was starting a team in a church league. So we went down to Baptist Temple, where we went to church, and Dad was one of the coaches. Dad coached that team. We had a bunch of boys on the team, and I was a sixth grade. It was a fourth, fifth, and sixth grade team, and Robert was a fourth grader, and we won the championship 3 years in a row. Dad coached all those years, and Dad was an excellent coach. Robert became the star in a couple of years, and Dad had a very unique philosophy of coaching. We pressed full court the whole game. Other teams had never been coached to bring the ball up the court against a press, and we would get ahead 20-2, 20-4, and Dad played everybody. And he would keep 4 of the starters on the floor, then he put one kid in that was not so good, and nobody else could shoot the ball until that second string kid or third string kid, by the time we got going, had a chance to shoot and score. And everybody got to play, and everybody got a chance to shoot and a chance to score. And we beat everybody. We went to the city championship, and we won that every year for 3 years. I could only play 1 year because then I went into junior high school. So as time went on, Dad saw that Robert and I, and Robert particularly, was going to be really good. And so he looked around for a way to get some good coaching. And he found out that there was a camp up in New Hampshire called Greylag. And the Boston Celtics in those years, this would have been 47, 48, 49, 50, 51, those years. Bob Cousy was the outstanding player on that team. And Bob Cousy had a basketball camp in New Hampshire called Greylag. I think it cost about $300 a month to go. And Dad and Mom scrimped and saved, and Dad made pretty good money, but not a lot. And so we went up there to play basketball and be coached for a month. Bob Cousy was the first guy in the NBA to dribble the ball behind his back, to make passes behind his back. Rod Hundley, who was an All-American at West Virginia, played in the NBA, learned watching Bob Cousy play, and Hundley dribbled behind his back and passed the ball behind his back. But we learned to play basketball at a high level, playing up there. Robert was the camper of the year or of the month in his area, most outstanding camper. He went back 2 or 3 years in a row. I only went 2 years. Robert later became a counselor up there and became very good friends with Bob Cousy over those years. So that's the first place that we ever saw chain basketball nets. And after that, we began to put them up everywhere we ever moved. We put up those chain nets. After a while, my grandmother on my dad's side died, and my grandfather moved in with us. My mom's parents already lived with us. Then Nancy was born. She was 10 years younger than Robert, 12 years younger than me. So we had 8 people living in that house. It was a great house, but it was too small for us. So we built a larger house up on the hill in Charleston. And that was a great house. We put up a very good basketball hoop there that was a really good place to play. And we moved up there. And by now, I was a sophomore in high school. I wasn't very good. I wasn't good enough to play on the first string. But Robert by now was playing well in junior high. So as we played up there, my sophomore year, I played on the B team. The sophomores at that school, the coach had a rule. Sophomores couldn't play on the varsity. So I played on the B team that year, but after that I quit and just played church league the next 2 years. But that year there was a kid at another school there. The school was called East Bank, and they were outstanding. They beat our high school 90-45. And one kid on their team scored 45 points. He scored as many points as we did. And we fell in love with that kid, and we went everywhere to watch them play. And when the tournament started, we went to watch that team play, East Bank. So they were playing in the final game in the sectionals, and if they won that game, they were going to go to Morgantown to the finals. So we went to watch that team play, and we sat on their side of the bleachers against the other team, Huntington. And we're cheering for them, and this lady in front of us turns around and says, "Who are you? You're not from East Bank. You're strangers here. Why are you rooting for us?" And Mom turned, and Mom always did the talking. Dad didn't talk much. Mom said, "We've been following East Bank ever since you guys beat us. We're from Stonewall Jackson. This shirt is our Stonewall colors, scarlet and gray. And I'm wearing that because it was our high school colors." And Mom said, "We've been in love with this team ever since we saw you guys play. We love watching Jerry play." And she said, "Who are you?" And Mom said, "I'm Mrs. Camp." And she said, "You're Elizabeth Camp? You're the one that wrote the letter to Jerry?" And Mom said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." She said, "You need to come down after the game and meet Jerry. My mom and dad are here." Of course, the Jerry was Jerry West. Mom wrote the very first fan letter that Jerry West ever got. So after the game, we went down and met Mr. and Mrs. West and met Jerry. And Mr. and Mrs. West invited us to come down to their home in Shielding, which was on the river, Canal River. And so a couple of weeks later, we went down, and after the tournament was over, to meet them, had a great time meeting them. We went on to the tournament. East Bank won. Jerry was outstanding player, of course, as you can imagine. And they went on to win the championship. And then Jerry and a fella that was on the team that he beat named Willie Akers, they became very close friends. And Dad was big in the fraternity at Morgantown, and so he invited Jerry and Willie to come up to our house because the fraternity Dad belonged to, Delta Tau Delta, was having a big party for all of the graduating seniors, and he wanted Jerry and Willie to come up. So Jerry and Willie were going to come up to our house one evening to go to this swim party at our house and maybe get interested in joining Dad's fraternity. So when Robert and I found out that Jerry and Willie were coming up to the house, we didn't know what time they were coming, but starting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Robert and I are outside shooting baskets waiting for Willie and Jerry to come. So they were a little bit late getting there, so we met Jerry, hadn't met Willie, and they came up and we said, hey, you guys want to shoot some with us? So Jerry and Willie shot around with us for a little bit, and then Dad came out wondering where they were, got mad at Robert and me for stopping them and shooting baskets. But Jerry and Willie went in, went to the party, and then came back out. They never pledged a fraternity, of course. But that was our chance to get to meet Willie and Jerry. And then they went on to college, and by now I'm a junior in high school and then a senior, and Robert comes on to the sophomore year. I'm a senior in high school. And our senior year, our school was pretty good. In fact, we went to the state finals. But our coach had that rule that you could not play on the varsity if you were a sophomore. Robert was 6'5" as a sophomore. He was the second best player in the school, and they would not let Robert play on the varsity, which was the dumbest thing in the world because, as I say, he was the second best player in the school. We went to the state finals. In the final game, we were playing Parkersburg. Robert and I, and Carol was his girl, Sharon was my girl, we're watching. We both married those girls, by the way. We're watching the game. At halftime, we're ahead 12 points, and we're thinking we're going to win the state championship. Malcolm, who was the center, got in foul trouble and didn't get to play much of the second half. Gay Elmore, who was a close friend of ours, twisted his ankle, and the coach never played anybody but the first 5 until they either fouled out or got hurt, and now he's got guys that have to come in the game that have never played. If he'd have had Robert on that team, he'd have won the championship, but he lost. And Robert and I just sat there just laughing on the inside because he lost the championship because of his stupid rule, and we lost the championship. And that was very sad. But the other thing that I would say about living in Charleston is that we lived to play basketball. And in the summertime, Charleston was hot and Charleston was humid. And we'd go to the playgrounds to play basketball. Now, there were a lot of playgrounds in Charleston, all over. Every neighborhood had a full court basketball court. There was only one playground other than ours where the white guys would play basketball, and that was in South Charleston. And we'd go to South Charleston, it was about 6 or 8 miles away down the river. And we only went there once because we went down there to play. Those guys were a bunch of thugs. All they wanted to do was fight. And we didn't want to fight, we wanted to play basketball. But the black neighborhoods, they would play basketball. So we'd go up to Donnelly Street and we'd play 50 basket halves. We'd play 2 halves, so 100 baskets. And it'd take a long time to do that. So we'd play for 50 baskets and we'd get there and get out of the car and there'd be a bunch of little kids playing. So we'd go to one end and start shooting. And pretty soon, guys our age would start coming off the front porch and end up at the other end, and we'd start playing. It'd be 5 of them against 5 of us. I remember the first time we ever did it, Jim Eblin, we just called him Eblin. Eblin looked around, and he's looking at these black guys, and he's looking at us, and he said, okay, who's going to be shirts and who's going to be skins? And the black guys just look at him like he's crazy. And Elmore looks at Eblin and says, just shut up, Eblin, just shut up. And we just played, everybody kept their shirts on. Some of us took our shirts off, but we played 50 baskets, and then we'd go to this little mini mart across the street, get a big jug of root beer, sit down on the curb, drink the root beer, and then go back and play the other 50. The other place we'd go would be Wirtz Avenue. Wirtz Avenue was not a very good place to play because the basketball court wasn't level, it sloped. And the first time we got there, again, there's these little kids out there, 8, 9, 10 years old, just goofing around, and there weren't many guys that would come out. And these kids are yelling, they're yelling, Cheney! And after a while, this kid, a little bit older than we were, about 6'4", he comes loping down the street, running, and his name was Charles Farrell. And he'd been all-state in the black high schools before integration. But he never, I think, got a scholarship to go. But he was one of the best basketball players we ever played against. And he could have been really good if he'd ever gotten a scholarship. In fact, Robert played with him in a barnstorming league, and he got 40 points one night. Cheney was really good. He called him Cheney. Actually, it was a nickname. The story was that his grandmother called him Cheney because when he was born, he was so ugly, he looked like Lon Chaney. That's the story. That's why Cheney was called Cheney. But he killed us. He got 3 or 4 10 or 12-year-old guys, and he beat us by himself. That's how good he was. But we lived to play ball. That's what we did. And so when Robert was a sophomore, he couldn't play. But when he was a junior, tragic thing happened. Christmas Eve, we were all home for Christmas, and maybe about 10 o'clock that night at home, Robert realized that there were a couple of people in our family that didn't have as many presents as he thought they should have. So at 10 o'clock at night, Robert got in his car. He really didn't say anything to anybody. He just left. And he went out, because there was a Cohen's drugstore, which was an all-night drugstore, but they had gifts. And Robert went out to try and buy a gift for a couple of people that in the family that he didn't think had enough gifts. I don't know. It was one of our grandparents, or maybe it was Aunt Mary or Miss Bessie who were visiting with us, our great-grandmother. And he went out and he went to Kanawha City. As he went over the Kanawha City Bridge, it was snowing, and there was ice on the bridge, and he skidded and almost went into the river, but he ran the car into the railing that kept him from going into the river, and he broke his leg. This was Christmas Eve. The basketball season had hardly started, and he didn't play the rest of that year. And in fact, when he was in the hospital and they set his leg and put him in a cast, he got an infection in his heel, a bone infection, and he didn't play the whole rest of that year. And that was tragic because he lost a whole year. He lost his sophomore year not being able to play with the varsity. So he missed out on good coaching. His junior year, he only played a few games, didn't get to play the whole second half of the season. Then his senior year, he played, but they didn't have a very good team. And so another tragic thing happened at the end of his senior year. I was a sophomore at Morgantown. He drove up to Morgantown on Mother's Day weekend to visit me. And on Saturday morning, when he woke up, he had a terrible fever. His temperature spiked up over 105, I think. And he couldn't drive home. Dad had to come up and get the car. They took him home. He was chilled. He would go from fevers to chills. They put him in the hospital in Charleston. It was terrible. He was losing weight, and finally Mom and Dad, he had lost so much weight, they took him to the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland. And he lost weight. He's 6'8" now at this point. He lost weight down to about 138 pounds. And the doctors in Cleveland told Mom and Dad that if he doesn't reverse this trend, if he doesn't start gaining weight, the damage to his organs will be irreversible and they won't be able to save him. And the headlines in the newspaper were about Robert. Everybody was concerned. Everybody was praying. And it was really scary. I was home with Nancy and my 3 grandparents. My grandfather Camp was still working, of course. My grandfather Willits had a heart condition, was pretty much disabled. And my grandmother Willits, Mimi, was taking care of everything. And I was working, but it was terrible. It was terrible. And finally, they reversed it. And he began to get better. They never did find out what was wrong. But he flew home from Cleveland August 1st. And he had a full scholarship to Morgantown. The big question was, would he be able to keep the scholarship? And Coach Schaus, Fred Schaus, who later went on to coach the Lakers, Coach Schaus said if he wants that scholarship, he can have it. And so he flew home August 1st, and he had gained most of the weight back, but it was all in his stomach because they had just pounded the calories down. And so August 1st, he gets off the plane, and he and I and the other guys, Wiseman and Elmore and Bruce and Tommy Halstead and all those guys, we started playing basketball. And that's all we did was play basketball. It took him a long time to get back in shape, and he lost most of that fat, but we go to Morgantown the first week of September, and we start class, and we go down to the field house. We couldn't start formal practice yet. So at this point, I'm a junior, he's a freshman. We're living together at Mrs. Vanyo's house, and every spare minute we're playing basketball down at the field house, class starts, he plays freshman basketball and did pretty well as a freshman. They had a really good team, but they redshirted him his freshman year. And my freshman year, when I was there, they had 8 guys on scholarship. They needed 2 more, so I'm backing up a little bit here. I left something out. My freshman year, they put out a call. They needed 2 more guys because with only 8 guys, they couldn't scrimmage. So they put out a call to the freshman class. They were going to have tryouts 3 days later. So 200 guys showed up to try out for 2 spots. Now, my roommate was Dick Dubois. One of the coaches was his uncle, George King, who had played in the NBA. So it was Coach Schaus who played in the NBA, George King who played in the NBA. George King was Dick's uncle, and I had a 6'8" brother. I don't know if that had anything to do with it because they were going to recruit him, but I made the team. So I had a roommate who was a nephew of one of the coaches, and had a 6'8" brother they were recruiting. So I think that had something to do with why I made the team. Never played much. And at the end of the year, I knew I was going to make the team as a sophomore. So I went to Coach Schaus, and I said, I'm not going to play much, am I? He said, no, Scott, you're not. I said, well, I want to be a manager because I want to go with the team. And he said, you can do that. So I became a manager, and I was a manager the next year as a sophomore when Jerry was a senior. But the previous year when I was a freshman, the West Virginia team went to the finals and got beat by Cal in Louisville by 1 point. And that was a heartbreak, I will tell you that. But Robert came on then as a freshman, played well. Sophomore year, he was a redshirt. The next year, I graduated. But if I go back to Robert's circumstance, it was hard for him to lose those 2 years. And I think it had a profound effect on him psychologically. His redshirt year, he didn't play much, or didn't play at all. His sophomore and junior year, the team wasn't really very good, and he wasn't playing. So he called Cousy. Most people don't know this. He called Cousy, whom he had played as a counselor for and had developed a friendship. Cousy by now had retired, was coaching at Holy Cross, and he asked Cousy, do you have a spot for me there? Can I transfer to Holy Cross and play? And Cousy said, Bob, I'm sorry. I've got a full slate. I don't have any empty scholarships. You could come up and we could maybe help you out maybe next year. But Robert decided no, that he would stay at Morgantown and see what happened. So his senior year, he was the star of the team. They had a terrible team. They didn't play well. And through the year, he was one of the players, only 3 players in West Virginia history. You may have heard me talk about this. There are only 3 players in West Virginia history, as far as I know, that have ever led the team in scoring, rebounds, and assists in the same year. One of them was Jerry. The other one was Rod Thorne, who was 1 year behind me, 2 years ahead of Robert. And in that time, Robert is the other one. Thorne, you may not know much of Thorne. He was an All-American, got drafted, played in the NBA, later became the general manager of the Bulls, and he is the guy who drafted Michael Jordan for the Bulls. So that was Rod's main claim to fame. So Robert's senior year, he made 23 free throws in a row, and that was a record for a long time. And he shot 80% from the free throw line. In fact, he was so good a free throw shooter that when they were playing on the defensive end, if somebody on the other team fouled one of their players, Robert would go to the free throw line, and the other player who had been fouled would lag behind, and Robert would shoot the free throws for the other player. Only one referee ever caught on, that was Red Mihalik. And he caught Robert going to the free throw line and said, get out of here, Cam, get out of here. It's Sones, it's Retchai, or it's Lentz, or Quartermont that's supposed to be shooting the free throw line. So they go to the Southern Conference tournament. They are 11-14. They've won 11 games and they've lost 14. They win the first game. I don't remember who it was they were playing. But in the semifinals, they go up against Davidson. Davidson is number 6 in the country at that time. They're 24-2. 2 weeks earlier, they had beaten West Virginia 103-80. George King, who by now has been promoted to head coach. Schaus has gone to the Lakers when Jerry was drafted by the Lakers and had become the head coach of the Lakers. George makes the prediction that the Mountaineers are going to win the tournament, and he was laughed out of town. had such a prediction at 11-14, knowing that at some point they'd have to play Davidson 26-2. So now they play Davidson, and WVU is ahead most of the game. And Davidson is pressing them, and they win against Davidson in overtime. They have a kid on that team named Fred Hetzel, who is a first-team All-American, who goes on to play in the NBA. He's guarding Robert. Robert brings the ball up the court as a guard against Hetzel. And the reason George did that is that Robert had the skills to dribble the ball and bring it up the court. Hetzel had never guarded a guard. He had only guarded forwards and centers. So he had no ball guarding skills. And Robert brought the ball up against him. Now, how could Robert do that? Because for most of his life, until he was a sophomore in high school, he played against a guy who was better than he was, who was bigger than he was, and he had to learn to handle the ball. Who was that guy? It was me. It was me. So Robert owes his success against Hetzel to me. Now, he's dead now, so he can't argue about that. But I've told him that before. I was always bigger than Robert. He had to learn to shoot from outside. He had to learn to handle the ball. And until he got to be 6'5", I could generally beat him. Now, he beat me once in a while, but most of the time I could beat Robert until he got to be a sophomore. So they win that game in overtime. Now they come up against William and Mary. They beat them 70-67 in double overtime. So now they are 15-15, and they go into the NCAA tournament. At this time, I'm in Germany, and I'm coaching and playing the division team, and we're playing in the Army Championship, the European Army Championship. We win the European Army Championship at the same time that Robert is playing in the NCAA Championship against Providence. Unfortunately, they lost that game, so they ended up for the season as one of the few teams to ever go into the NCAA tournament and end up with a losing record at 14-15. Let me talk about Germany for a minute. Robert and Carol got married at the start of their senior year. And so they came to Germany on part of their honeymoon and stayed with us in Germany. So Robert and I, when I had off-duty time, we would go over to one of the posts that had a big gym where I was coaching. And we would play 3-on-3 basketball against other guys in the Army. That summer, the West Point cadets that were going to be starting their senior year, many of them came to Germany as part of their duty before their senior year. And they would come to this same gym and would play in that 3-on-3 stuff. And they were a bunch of thugs. They would come on, and there were some of the guys that were on the West Point team. And we had a guy that I coached, a guy named John Grubb, who was from Wytheville, Virginia. John, I doubt you're watching this, but if you are, thank you for helping us win. Robert and I and John Grubb would play against these guys. And they would push, and they would shove, and they would hack. And John Grubb and Robert and I would beat these guys. We'd run a screen away for Robert, and Robert would hit a 15-foot jump shot. And they had no idea who we were and could not figure out how in the world these Army guys could beat them. And we beat them every time. And they would refuse to get off the court. Winners stay on, losers go sit down. And we beat those guys, and they hated it. The other good thing that happened that summer, Sharon was pregnant with my second son, Jim, about 9.5 months pregnant, because this was August. And he was born September 2nd, which happened to be Sharon's birthday. So we went to Venice, drove all night to get down there, had a great time in Venice, came back, then Robert and Carol flew home. So Robert's postgraduate, he was not drafted. He had a job with the Charleston Recreation Center as the recreation director for the city of Charleston, but he got a call from Houston to have a tryout. But Robert played barnstorming basketball. At the end of the season every year, most of the colleges in the area, Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, some of the Virginia, North Carolina players that had graduated were playing these tournaments and could earn money. Robert played for a bar in Moundsville or Wheeling. I guess it was Wheeling. The Castle Club, PI was the owner of that. and they could win money playing these barnstorming tournaments. But he sprained his ankle, and he had a job, and Carol was pregnant with Danny. Danny was born about that time, and Robert was never able to go on to try out with Houston. And I think in some way he regretted that, but it never happened. But instead, he played in the Eastern League with the Scranton Miners. There were two pretty famous guys that played on that team. One of them was a guy named Bill Spivey, who had played at Kentucky in the 50-51 season. Spivey was famous, 7'1" center. Kentucky had great teams in those years. Adolph Rupp was the coach. Spivey was caught in the point shaving scandals and was banned from the NBA for life. But he played on that Scranton Miners team. A guy named York Larisi played on that team. Famous player from Syracuse, who later went on to coach at Syracuse. I think he is the number 3 winningest basketball coach in college basketball of all time. Jim Boeheim played on that team. Robert played guard on that team. They had 2 black guys, one of them from Kansas, one of them from Niagara, a guy named Willie Murrell and a guy named Willie Hemans. Robert played guard on that team. That's how good his ball handling skills were. So later on, Robert and I then opened a carpet store in Roanoke, Virginia. Mom and Dad moved to Roanoke to help us with that. Mom had an advertising background. She came and wrote our ads. And she wrote ads for TV that Robert and I would do. And we would say, tell them that Mom sent you. She wrote ads. People would come in and say, Mom sent us to come in and buy carpet. And we had one guy who came in and said, oh, that's a bunch of junk. You've got some professional lady writing the ads. Your mother didn't write these ads. And Mom happened to be in the back room writing ads that day when he came in. And I said to him, you don't believe my mother wrote these ads? You think this is just a hoax? He said, that's right. Those ads are too good. Your mother couldn't have written those ads. I said, just a minute, buddy. So I went back and I said, Mom, come out here. So out comes this little old lady with her glasses down on her nose. Yes, boys, what do you want? I said, Mom, I want you to meet this fellow. He doesn't believe you exist. That cracked him up and he bought carpet. We played on a city league there, Robert and I, and we had been out of town on a tour with one of our vendors, and we'd flown in. We had a game that night in the tournament at the end of the season, and we didn't get back from the trip until halftime. So we rushed to get back, and we were behind at halftime. We were playing one of the better teams. We were behind, and there was only a couple of minutes left. I was guarding one of the better players, a guy named Jency. I remember it very well. And we were behind, and I was trying to foul him, and I was either trying to steal the ball or to get a foul, and so I was hacking him across the arm. He didn't like that, and he punched me, knocked me down. And Robert came over, and he ran in the bathroom and locked the door. And Robert's pounding on the door, and he says, Jency, just let me come in and have a conversation with you. And the referees threw Robert out of the game, threw Jency out of the game, and we got beat. But there was Robert sticking up for me. One other story about Joe Moses. Joe Moses was one of our carpet installers, and he was a pretty big drinker. And on Christmas Day, Joe came to my house with his family. And he was drunk, and Mom and Dad were over at Robert's house, and Sharon and I and the boys were having Christmas. And Joe came up and knocked on my door early Christmas afternoon. And I opened the door, and Joe was standing there with a gun. He said, look what I got for Christmas. It's a Centennial Memorial gun. Scott, look at this. And I said, Joe, get out of here. I don't want that gun in my house. And he said, it's a Centennial gun. And I said, get out of here. And he said, I said, go over and show it to Robert. Robert would want to look at that. And he left. And Sharon said, what in the world did you send him over to Robert's house for? I said, let Robert deal with it. I don't want to fool with it. He went over to Robert's house. And he went in and he got in the house. Mom and Dad are there. Robert's there. And Robert says, Joe, what are you doing with that gun? And Joe says, I got it for Christmas. It was a Christmas present. And it works. And he fired it out the window. The window was open. He fires the gun out the window. Robert grabs the gun away from him. Joe's drunk as he can be. And Robert says, get out of here. And Robert keeps the gun and gives it to Joe the next day. And Joe gets out and drives away. About half an hour later, Joe comes back, knocks on the door. Robert opens it up and there's Joe. Robert says, Joe, what are you doing back here? And he says, Bobby says, can you call AAA for me? He says, I've got a flat tire. Turns out when Joe fired the gun out the window, he hit his car and gave himself a flat tire. Can you imagine that? He could have shot in the car and shot one of his kids or his wife. I never told Robert that I sent Joe over there for a long time, as you can imagine. So as time went on, we moved to California. Robert moved to Florida. The next time we really got together was in 1987, which was Mom and Dad's 50th wedding anniversary. And it was in California. And Robert was there, Danny was there, my boys were there. And we went down to Laguna Beach. And there was a basketball court in Laguna Beach there was an outdoor court. And a lot of guys came there to play. And there was a Marine base down at El Toro. And there were a bunch of guys that came up there and a lot of guys from Southern California that would go down there and play. And it was one of those, get in line and you can get up. And Danny was there. Danny, if you're watching this, you know what this is. You can't read it because it's backward, but maybe we can fix that. This is from the Santa Cruz Boardwalk that Danny won shooting at the Santa Cruz Boardwalk. Because if you've ever gone to one of these carnivals and try to win a basketball, you know how hard that is because those baskets are rigged. But Danny shot and won this basketball and gave it to me, which I still value and cherish, Danny. So Danny and Scott and I and Robert got in line to play basketball. Mom and Dad are there, Sharon, and all the kids watching. And Robert and Danny and I got up and we won. And we're playing and we keep winning. And then these four guys, and it was 4-on-4, these four guys from Marine Base get on. And we beat them. And then they get back up again. And Danny is the star, and we're doing screenaways for Danny. Robert throws me the ball. He goes and screens away for Robert. I pass the ball to Danny. Danny shoots a 15-footer, and it's nets all the time. And then Danny got the ball in the corner, went down and dunked on some guy, and he didn't like that. So then they started just hammering Danny, fouling him, and then it's our ball, but every time they just foul him. And finally we just quit and went on. But at that time, 1987, I'm 47 years old, Robert's 45, and we're beating these 20-year-old guys. That's how good Danny is. And that's what a good screen Robert could fit. But there's one thing that we always knew about shooting. That is, you keep your elbow, and we see guys shooting with their elbows out. The rule is, guys, if you're watching, is you keep your elbow in. And I would talk to Robert from time to time, and he'd be playing basketball in Florida somewhere. I'd say, how are you doing? He says, oh, Scott. He says, I play, and he says, my head hurts, my back hurts, I'm achy all over, but he says, there's still magic in the fingers. And we would laugh about it. There's still magic in the fingers. In 1994 and 95, I lived in Denver, Sharon and I did, and there was a 3-on-3 tournament coming to Denver. You get 4 guys on your team and 3 play at a time. So I called Scott, my son, oldest son, Danny and Robert, and they flew in. We played in this national 3-on-3 tournament. Now, at that time, I was about 55. Maybe Robert would have been 53. Scott and Danny would have been about 33. And we were hoping we could get into the 40-year-old bracket. But they said, no, you got to be in the bracket of the youngest guys. So we're in a 32, 33-year-old bracket. And it's outdoors on blacktop, and it's hot. And we won the first couple of games because Danny and Robert were still pretty good. Scott was a ferocious defensive player, and all I'm doing is passing the ball. But you played 3 guys at a time. And we get to the semifinals. If we win this game, we're in the finals. We're playing against a team that is pretty big, but they're not as good as we are. And we're up maybe a basket. And I think you played to maybe 15 baskets. You have to win by 2. And there's this big kid. He's about 6'6", and he's guarding Robert. He's just hammering Robert in the back, just hammering him in the back. And Robert turns around to him. He says, look, pal, he says, please don't hit me in the back. You're killing me. You're hurting my back, and it's hurting. And I really can't put up with that. Please don't do that. He goes, shut up, old man. And Robert said, if you keep doing that, he said, I'm going to smack you. And I'm thinking, that ain't going to be good. And the guy keeps doing it. And Robert turns around and pushes him away. And the guy hits Robert, and they end up wrestling around on a blacktop. They throw both of the guys out. That was a bigger loss to us than it was to them. And we ended up getting beat. And so we came in 3rd on that tournament. So we say we were the second or third best team in the country that year. So at that point, Robert and I never really played again together, which was sad. But we did work again together, working for a company that did Chamber of Commerce marketing. So we traveled together, stayed in the same motels, worked at different places in California, had a really good time being together. At one point, one of the best times, this would have been late 1998, 99. We lived with my son Scott and his wife Sally and their 3 boys in the Bay Area, and we in Martinez. And I guess this is the last time we did anything in basketball together. My son Scott was coaching his 13-year-old son, Scott V. There are now 6 Scotts, my great-grandson, Scott. And we lived with them waiting for our house in Red Bluff to be built. And Scott was coaching his 13-year-old son in a city league in Alameda. And they played and coached in this naval base in Alameda that had these huge, big hangar kind of places with 6 or 8 basketball courts in them. So Robert and I would go over when they would practice in the evenings, and there would always be at least one cross court that was empty, nobody in it. Robert and I would pick up a ball and we'd go over. And Robert and I had a drill that we'd been doing for years, that one of us would rebound and the other one would shoot. When it was your turn to shoot, you had 3 chances to make a shot. If you didn't make a shot and you weren't shooting layups, you were shooting 15 to 18 feet, and you had 3 chances to make a shot. If you didn't make a shot in 3 shots, you rebounded, the other guy would shoot. But we could always make a shot in 3 shots. So Robert would shoot, I'd throw the ball back. I'd throw the back. Robert would shoot, and he might make 15, 18 shots in a row from maybe 20 feet out. And then he'd miss, and then I'd go out and shoot. And there were a lot of parents there that would get tired of watching these little kids shooting the ball, and they'd come over and sit in the bleachers and watch us shoot. And we could shoot pretty well. And we'd hear these people talking, and they would say, "Who are those guys? Who are they? Where are they from?" We'd be shooting. Remember, keep your elbow in. Keep your elbow in. And we'd shoot the ball for maybe half an hour, and we'd get tired and go sit down. One time, somebody came over and asked us for an autograph. "Who are you guys? Where are you from?" We'd laugh and tell them we're from West Virginia, but we were nobody. We're just out there shooting the ball, just shooting the ball. Keep your elbow in. And then we'd laugh and go home. That's really the last time we really shot the ball much. 2000 till now, the only real time we had any time together, I made a road trip back to West Virginia just a few years ago, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, before Sharon got sick. We had a great time. I flew back to Orlando. Robert and the boys and Liz and Chrissy came up and watched the boys play in the tournament in Orlando and had a good time with that. We drove back to Charleston, went to all the old places. Everything seemed small and cluttered and close together. Went on to Morgantown, saw some old friends. Went on to Clarksburg, where he visited with one of the boys he'd coached there, Bud. Nancy came over from Maryland, picked me up. Robert, I think we rode in his van. I think he visited Bud a little longer and then drove back home. Common thing for old guys like us. When you guys who are listening to this get old, you'll know what I mean. The older we get, the better we were. So Robert and I were pretty good, I think. At least he was, and I was not too bad. My last conversation with Robert was 2 weeks ago. Called an old friend to get caught up. And when I would talk with Mary, she was on the committee that always did our class reunions, that I always call her and ask her, did anybody die that I didn't know about? No, so Mary and I talked, and so I called Robert to talk to him. Very out of character. He was not feeling well. He'd been unwell. He'd been in the hospital and in a skilled nursing facility. I talked to him about talking to Mary, and he said, "Scott, I don't care. I don't care. I feel terrible. I feel terrible." And he just hung up on me. And he and I would trick each other and hang up. Sometimes you could hang up first, but it was never like this. And I realized that he was never going to be happy again. He was not ever going to be content and never be comfortable. And I just thought, oh my, this is not good. And Monday night, the night before he died, I had a meeting with the deacons in my church. I'm a pastor. This is my church office here where I am. And I talked with the deacons afterwards, and I asked them to pray for my brother Robert. They knew him. They'd met him. He'd been out here a couple of times. And they asked me, "Do you think it's terminal?" And I said, "No, I don't think so, but I think it's pretty grim." So they prayed for him, and then I went home. And before I went to bed, I prayed, and I said, "God, would you please take care of my brother?" Then I went to bed. And the next morning, I got the call from Nancy that he had died. And I thought, God has taken care of my brother. Thank you, God. And then I thought about something 50 years ago. A friend of mine named Ted and you may have heard of a book that was popular 1975 to about 1980 called The Late Great Planet Earth. A man named Hal Lindsey had written this book. It was pretty famous, and it was about the return of Jesus. And in this book, he makes a point, and Ted and I had gone to hear him speak one night. And in the book, Lindsey talks about the return of Jesus, and he says, what would happen, he's talking to this crowd, if somebody you loved didn't know Jesus, and if you died before Jesus came back, who would go tell that person about Jesus? And Ted said to me, Scott, what happened if you died before Robert ever heard about Jesus? Who would tell him about Jesus? And I thought about that, and I said, I've got to go back to North Carolina. I'm in the furniture business at that time. I said, I think I'm going to go back to Florida and talk to Robert and Carol. And so a couple of months later, I did go back on business, and Danny and Liz and Jay, I don't know if you remember this, Chrissy, you weren't born yet. But I did go back to North Carolina, and I did fly to, I think it was either Tampa or Orlando. You guys didn't live far from there. And Robert and Carol and the three older kids met me there. We checked into a hotel because it was maybe an hour and a half back to where you lived. And we bought a pizza, and the motel had a tennis court up on the top, and you guys were big into tennis. We ate pizza and played tennis up that night, and then we stayed at the motel. And then the next day, we went back down to your house and stayed there until early afternoon. And Carol made pancakes, I remember that. And I talked to you all about Jesus. And your mom and dad accepted Jesus and became Christians. And it began a time when you were very faithful at going to church for that period. And I came home, and then that next morning after I had prayed, Nancy called and Robert had passed away. So I'm going to close in just a minute, and I want to talk about heaven for a minute before I close. And I do this for three reasons. I want to comfort you who knew Robert in this time of loss. So I want to talk about heaven, and I want to comfort you, and I want to excite those of you who know Jesus and who have the same precious hope that Robert had. And for those of you who don't know Jesus, I want to give you something of the hope about heaven that I think may help you. Heaven is not very well understood by us, and if people think about heaven at all, they usually think about it as maybe it's a better alternative than hell. But most people don't think about heaven as being desirable for its own merits. They think about it as a better alternative than hell. But they think about it in comparison to a horrible place. And that's very sad, because heaven is valuable and glorious on its own. It's rich and abundant, and it's valuable for its own sake. And when you understand what the Bible says about heaven in the book of Revelation, it says that there's a new heaven. There's going to be a new earth, and there's a real river there. This river is flowing from the throne of God, and there's a real tree there with real fruit that has real life. There's real people, the people that God has redeemed and given real life. It's the people of God who've been resurrected to new life. And the people who have believed in him that have gone before us are there. Death was not an end for Robert and for those who have believed in Jesus. It was the beginning. And it can be like that for you too. So let me pray, and then I close, and then I will say goodbye. So Father, I thank you for this life that Robert had, this life that was very flawed, that was not perfect. It is a life that is never perfect for any of us. And I pray for his family, those who loved him and knew him, that you would give them grace. I pray, Father, that you might comfort them through this time of loss and be their companion and give them grace and peace. Pray, Father, you might bless us as we go through our lives, that you might give us a sense of peace, and that in all of this, Father, you might give us hope. I ask this all, Jesus, in your name. Amen. Thank you for listening. Goodbye. God bless you. Remember, keep your elbow in when you shoot the ball. Keep your elbow in. Good night.